You are listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I am your host, Ali Essig. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to remind you that I will be speaking at Restore this year. Restore is a Faith Matters gathering where thousands of people will be coming together in Orem, Utah at UVU, September 26th through the 27th. And as we gather, we'll be listening to inspiring speakers and beautiful music and see even incredible art. I'm so excited to be talking about the deeper wisdom within the Word of Wisdom. I'm preparing my talk now, and I just cannot wait to share it with you. So if you want to come and hear me speak, then grab your tickets at faithmatters.org and use the code PLANTWISE, PLANTWHYS, and you can get 10% off. Okay, today's episode I am fired up about. I am so excited to dive into a very common misconception about the Word of Wisdom. And I like to refer to it as the drama of the comma. This is something I've heard about for years and years of people really trying to justify their preferred way of eating by blaming it all on the comma when it comes to the Word of Wisdom. Because if you truly do read the Word of Wisdom, you understand that eating meat should be done sparingly, and it creates cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is where you believe one thing, but do something else. And if you are a faithful Latter-day Saint wanting to follow the Word of Wisdom, you're like, I want to believe this, but I do this. And I may be seeing benefits by eating this certain way, whether it's the carnivore diet or the keto diet. So how can I justify this? And there's a way, and there's a very common way that a lot of people have been doing for a long time. And it's all about the drama of the comma. So there was a recent YouTube video that goes deep into it, and I thought this is the perfect example. And let's dive into the false belief that is held around this by using this YouTube video as an example. Now, the video is called False Traditions Around the Word of Wisdom's Eat Meat Sparingly with expert Bruce Porter. So we're going to start at the beginning. Now, Bruce Porter is a gospel scholar. I do not see a PhD or any other title behind his name besides the fact that he's written 16 books about church stuff, mainly most like the Pearl of Great Price, things like that. So that's his background. He's not a nutritionist. He doesn't have a doctorate degree in anything, but there's a lot of opinions about eat meat sparingly. So let's dive into it. I am so excited. I'm going to share my screen with those watching it on YouTube. Otherwise, if you're just listening to the podcast, you can just listen in.
There's always this question of meat. And when you and I spent some time in 2018 in Israel, you made a comment on this that I've always remembered and wanted you to talk about. So will you take us through verses 12 and 13, which talk about the use of meat and perhaps why the traditional belief that we have is wrong and some people have misunderstood this?
Okay, I have to stop right here. The traditional belief we have around meat and eating meat sparingly. A tradition. What is a tradition? A tradition is something that many people follow. In our church, not a lot of people are eating meat sparingly. I am one of very few faithful Latter-day Saints that really have dived deep into this topic and really believe that there's power in it. And there's not a lot of us. In fact, if you think of traditions, like what is a tradition in the church? A tradition in the church looks something like making funeral potatoes for funerals. How often do members of our faith do that? But around the world, it is not a common tradition to eat meat sparingly. So even saying that this is a false tradition is incorrect because it's not a tradition. No one's eating meat sparingly. I'm sorry. Even the best of the best are not really acting on this principle. Now, does it matter? Does it affect their eternal salvation? No, not at all. And I'm not one to say that it does or that it will. But to say that this is a false tradition, I think is completely incorrect. Now, Bruce gives a background of the Word of Wisdom, which we've done many times before. So I want to just dive straight into the meat, literally, quite literally, the meat of what they say around, particularly, he says, mistakes in the Word of Wisdom. So let's hear it.
Now in 12 and 13 is where we begin to make mistakes, as well as when it talks about grain later on. 12, it says, Yea, the flesh also of beasts and the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me, and this is verse 13, and it's pleasing unto me that they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter, comma, or cold, comma, or famine. So this, when you read that, it's not pleasing to me that It is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. Now, that comma was not there in the original. That comma was not there in the Book of Commandments and was not put in until about 1920. And if you read it without that comma, it completely changes it. Speaking of meat, it says in verse 13, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. But looking up at verse
Now,
12,
do you see the drama in the comma? Do you see the drama in the comma? The fact that it was added. Anyway,
God has ordained them for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And then in verse 13, he's saying they should not be used only in times of winter, cold, or famine. Well, you have to ask yourself, well, what's in the meat that we need? Well, it comes down to protein.
okay. Before we go into the drama of the comma, which I'm going to dive into in a second, I have to stop there. I am a nutritionist. Gospel scholar Bruce Porter is not. And that is simply incorrect when it comes to protein. So he is saying that do we need to be eating all the time and not just in winter or famine or excess hunger because we need protein. It's not correct to say that we only get protein from meat because we don't. Protein is super important. Don't get me wrong, but God has made sure that we get enough protein as long as we're eating enough calories because protein is in everything. There are plant-based sources of protein, and no, they don't have to be fake meat to be a plant-based source of protein. Lentils, for example, are a fantastic plant-based source of protein. In fact, a clinical trial at the University of Illinois compared a vegan diet to an omnivore diet in the context of weight training and moderate but sufficient daily protein intake. So that was 1.1 to about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. Here's the key. Researchers found no significant difference in muscle protein synthesis rates between the two groups. As long as you're getting enough protein, it does not have to be from meat. It can be from plants, and you can get the exact same results, right? When daily protein needs are met appropriately, plant-based sources can support muscle growth just as effectively as animal-based sources. And you can argue there's not enough leucine or there's not that, and that may be true. But when it comes to results, when it comes to muscle protein synthesis, it does not matter if the protein came from plants or if the protein came from meat. So you do not need meat for protein. That is an incorrect statement. That is completely false. So I just wanted to clear that up first. Now, could you argue that if you are not eating enough calories, you're not getting enough protein? Yes, correct. That's why there's children who are starving in Africa and have a significant protein deficiency if you're not eating enough calories. And so I would argue that maybe if you're dieting, if you're fasting, if you just had weight loss surgery and you can barely eat any calories, do you need to be a little bit more protein focused? Yes, of course. And maybe is it easier to get from animal products? Yeah, it may be easier, but it's not required. It's not required, especially in today's world where heck, you can get protein powder. We do not need meat to get our protein. All right, let's go on to the drama of the comma.
And he's basically saying there in verses 12 and 13 that we should be eating meat all the time sparingly.
Was there a belief at the time that meat was only to be used in time of winter? Because it almost seems like it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in the time of winter. Would he say that because there was some people that thought maybe that was the only time, but clearly we need to eat it all the time? Is that?
Well, we ate meat, and I grew up on a ranch without electricity, and so the time we ate most of our meat is when we'd butcher, or sometimes we'd kill, a deer or an elk or something like that. It would hang in the barn and freeze, and then we could eat it all winter. We could eat it all winter long because it's frozen. We didn't have a refrigerator. We didn't have a freezer for that kind of stuff because we didn't have the power. So we ate it mostly in times of winter and cold because it could be preserved in that. We would even sometimes preserve our meats in kind of a fat thing so that we could have that in the summertime that would seal out the air and stuff. And so it was used mostly, we just kept it in the barn. We'd go out and saw off a steak or a roast or whatever we wanted. The elk or the beef was frozen solid in the wintertime. And so that's the way we did it. But everybody hunted back then. Everybody had meat from the forest or whatever it was, wherever they could get it, be it small animals or large animals. Everybody ate meat. And that's what it's saying there. Eat it sparingly. It's supposed to be there. You should have it, and not to be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. It can be eaten all the time, because that's the protein. And you can eat fresh meat. If something's killed fresh, then you can eat it right. You can eat it right away. So, but notice in 14, now we've gone through the different.
Okay, so let's talk about a couple of points here. Number one, all the time sparingly. You heard him say that a couple of times. If you think about it, all the time sparingly, that is an oxymoron. That is a complete paradox. All the time sparingly. The definition of sparingly is occasionally, in a restricted or infrequent manner, in small quantities. So even justifying the fact that, okay, the comma was placed there in the 1920s, so it doesn't belong there, and that really it should say we should be eating it sparingly, but yeah, all the time, okay? But that is a complete paradox. That is an oxymoron. But okay, fine. You know what? If that's what you believe, that's okay. Let's look and see what maybe people believed when the word of wisdom came out. So before there was drama with the comma, before the comma was added, how did they read these verses? Did they read it as sparingly, or did they read it as all the time, or this interesting all the time sparingly? I think the absolute best person that we should look into their thoughts would be Hyrum Smith. Hyrum Smith was the brother of Joseph Smith. And this revelation was given to Joseph Smith. Okay. So you cannot get much closer at this point to really dive deep into what did he think? Was this very clear that we should be eating meat all the time? Or was it very clear that we should be eating meat sparingly, or some weird paradoxical in between that he's trying to argue? I'm going to go into what Hyrum Smith said. He said, God only is acquainted with the fountain of action and the main springs of human events. He knows where disease is seated and what is the cause of it. He is also acquainted with the spring of health, the balm of Gilead, of life. He knows what course to pursue to restore mankind to their pristine excellency and primitive vigor and health. And he has appointed the word of wisdom as one of the engines to bring about this thing, to remove the beastly appetites, the murderous disposition, and the vitiated tastes of men, to restore his body to health and vigor, promote peace between him and the brute creation, and as one of the little wheels in God's design to help to regulate the great machinery, which shall eventually revolutionize the earth and bring about the restoration of all things. And when they are restored, he will plant the tree of life, whose leaves shall be for the healing of the nations. And again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. Every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, all these things to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Now, for those of you who are on YouTube, you can see there's no comma because that's the original. There was no comma in the original. So he is citing the original text without the comma. Okay. So what is his view on this? And then he says, all grain is ordained for the use of man, and a beast to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. Okay, so what does Hyrum Smith have to say? We're all curious. What is his interpretation? And this is what he says. Let men attend to these instructions. Let them use the things ordained of God. Let them be sparing of the life of animals. It is pleasing, saith the Lord, that flesh be used only in times of winter or famine. And why to be used in famine? Because all domesticated animals would naturally die and may as well be made of use by man. Clearly we know where he stands. He says only use them in famine, and you can use them then because they're going to die anyway. So we might as well use them, make use of them. We know where he stood. This is Joseph Smith's brother. There was no comma when he read this. There was no comma at all when he read it, when he interpreted his beliefs. And there's so much there that I want to go deeper in. I will go deeper in when it comes to restore, but how truly what I believe is that as we get closer and closer to the millennium, when the lamb will sit down with the lion, we're all going to be vegetarian. And so as we get closer and closer to that lifestyle, we will usher in the millennium. We're all going to have to get there eventually. If that wasn't enough, if the drama around the comma wasn't enough, there is some things that he mentioned about grain that I really need to clarify. And I think it's so important to touch on. So let's dive into the part number 2, all about grain.
Categories. Now we're moving from meat to grain. In verse 14, all grain is ordained for the use of man, a beast, and the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heavens. And then in verse 15, it's different. It says, and these, speaking of grain, not meat, not vegetables, not fruits, speaking of grain, verse 14, all grain, and verse 15, and these God has made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess hunger. Now, for years, we've turned that around. Don't eat meat, eat grain all the time. But in reality, it's saying eat meat all the time sparingly, and the grain is to be used in times of famine and excess hunger. Well, the reason that is because they both hold protein. The meat holds protein, and the grain has protein in it. You can't store the meat like you can store grain. And so you eat meat and protein sparingly, year round, all the time, not only in cold or excess hunger. But grain is to be stored so that you can have protein when you don't have the meat. It's to be stored for famine and excess hunger, as it says in verse 15. And then it goes down and tells you what grains are good. All grain is good for the food of man and the fruit of the vine. Then it says, okay, here's the rule, and this is true even today. Wheat for man, corn for the ox, oats for the horse, rye for the fowls and for the swine and all beasts of the field, and barley for useful animals, and mild drinks as other grains. So it kind of gives us instruction there. But
do you think, and I'm just hearing this for the first time, this part, but do you perhaps associate this swapping that we did where we've believed for so long to eat grains as kind of the staple and meat sparingly, and it probably, according to what you just said, should be reversed, meat all the time, but grain sparingly, wheat in particular? Is this perhaps why people have gluten intolerance?
I think it is. I think it is. If we followed the word of wisdom, we wouldn't have that intolerance, that gluten intolerance. And my doctors keep telling me that I should, I'm iron deficient, and they keep telling me you need to eat more red meat. You need to have red meat. They're telling me to eat the stuff and carbohydrates, which is in the grain, which is good for famines and storage. You can store the grain where you can't store the meat the same way.
Where it says, I've ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving, nevertheless they are to be used sparingly, talking about meat. So you should be eating it consistently, perhaps even every day. You're just not supposed to overeat meat. Is that what sparingly means in that?
I think it does. I don't think it means just once a week or, I don't even know that it means once a day, but you eat it on a regular basis. And he says, not, as he says there, should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. Eat it. Yeah, that means all the time. Yeah.
You're supposed to eat it, and grain we should have probably been, a little bit dialed down with from what we have done, and perhaps that overexposure to wheat is perhaps what's led to a gluten epidemic, honestly. You said at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's dive into this. As you can see, he goes deeper into kind of justifying the sparingly all the time, the oxymoron of that. But I want to dive into the grains comments. Okay. So he says in verse 14, all grain is ordained for the use of man. Now he says that the grain is, we talk about for the use of man, and then it talks about the animals, right? So it says, should be used for use of man, beasts to the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. It says all wild animals, ending in S, okay? His conclusion is that in verse 15, and these. So let's talk about grammar for a second. So he's saying, and these hath God made for the use of men only in times of famine or excess hunger. He's saying grain. The grain should only be used for times of famine and excess hunger because you can store it. But grammatically, that does not equate. Like grammatically, that does not make sense. The sentence right before it says, and all wild animals. and these referring to the wild animals. And if it was to refer to the grain, it would say, and this, because grain. Now, okay, maybe you disagree with me, but do you disagree with the footnotes? Because if you look at the footnotes on these, because it could be confusing. Does he mean these the grain or these the animals? I don't know. I'm confused. So what do the footnotes say? And clearly, the footnotes are referred to Doctrine Covenants 49:18, and it says, and whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. So it is clarifying. We can't tell people to forbid from abstain from meats, but he's talking about meat. He's talking about meat here. It is very clear in the footnotes. So you can disagree with the footnotes. You can have different beliefs, but in scripture, it has clarified that when we say, and these, that it's referring to the wild animals. It is not referring to grain. But okay, maybe you can be like, maybe the footnotes are wrong, but again, it's another oxymoron. All grain is ordained for the use of man, for beasts, to be the staff of life. It would make sense if it said grain should be used sparingly. That would make sense. But it says grain is the staff of life. Okay, so I looked up the definition of the staff of life, and guess what it is? A staple or a necessary food. If it is a necessary food, if it is a staple, then why would you only eat it in times of famine or excess hunger? Again, it's this cognitive dissonance. It's wanting to eat one way, but seeing scriptures telling you to eat another way, and you've got to justify it. And this is the justification. And I have to call it out. It's BS. Like, it does not equate. It does not equate grammatically. It does not equate scripturally when you're denying that the footnotes are incorrect. And even just historically of what Hyrum Smith was saying at the time without the comment, right? It doesn't equate. This does not make sense. This argument is completely invalid. Now, you can choose not to eat meat sparingly. And again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect, it does matter in a lot of spiritual ways, I believe. But as far as your eternal salvation, can you still get eternal salvation and eat as much meat as you want? Can you still be carnivore or keto and be a good person and live a good life and return to heaven? Yes, of course. This is for our temporal salvation. This is not our eternal salvation. This is God telling us. And that quote from Hyrum Smith is so profound. He was like, who knows better than anyone else about the diseases that we might face? Who knows better than anyone else? It's going to be God. It's going to be him telling us these things, and we can justify it. We can make arguments against it, but he's the one that knows. But here's the last point I want to make about grain. In the past, I talked about how the word of wisdom is a chiasmus. Now, if you don't know what a chiasmus is, it means that the first part of the scripture is very similar to the last part of the scripture. So at the beginning, it says, this is a commandment that I give. And it's a principle with a promise, right? Adapted for the capacity of the weak and all saints. It's a principle with a promise. That's verse 3. And in verse 21, verses 18, 19, 20, 21, it's talking about the promise, right? Verse 21, and unto them a promise that the destroying angel shall pass by them. So he's given us the promise. Beginning is I'm going to give you the principle of the promise. And at the end, here's the promise. And then, the second to not quite the middle part, but like the second part is similar to the second to last part, and so on and so forth. And I've talked about in the past that the very center of the word of wisdom is the most important part. And again, and if you look just exactly at the center, that's going to be verse 10. And again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. And that we need to be consuming more fruits and vegetables. That's the center. But I think I actually stand corrected here. And I read another article where someone else argued that the true center of the word of wisdom, the point of the whole chiasmus, is actually verse 14, the grain part. Because listen to this, it's really cool. It says, all grain is ordained for the use of man and of beast to be the staff of life. Because at the center of it all, and we know that everything is symbolic of Christ, if you think of it, even to deny that we should only eat grain occasionally is to deny what Christ said, that he is the bread of life. So do we need the bread of life occasionally? Do we need bread occasionally? Now, could there be other reasons why there's gluten intolerances? Yes. Could it be the glyphosate? Could it be the fact that we're using a different type of wheat? Or I would say even more, the fact that we're not actually eating whole grains, we're eating refined grains, completely not even like the actual intact full grain. Could that be the cause of all these gluten intolerances? Yeah, but it's not because we're not eating grain or eating too much grain. Because truthfully, the center of this is pointing to Christ. The center of the word of wisdom is pointing to where all grain is the staff of life, that who is the true staff of life, who is our bread of life, that is Christ. That the center of the word of wisdom really is pointing back to Christ, going back to him. He is the staff of life. And it's beautiful, the symbolism of it, as you go deeper and deeper into the word of wisdom, but you have to be willing and open to learn new things and things that may be different than what you're following and how you're currently living. And so I just want to let you know that it's okay that people have other opinions about eating meat. I want to show you, in fact, the comments in this because it's really important to see why people are so excited. This video did really well. It has over 29,000 views, and I'm sure it's going to have even more. And as you read the comments, a lot of people are saying, thanks so much for showing me the comment drama. I am all about the carnivore diet. I've been keto for this long. I've been ketovore and fasting often for 5 years. I've reversed type 2 diabetes. I've lost 100 pounds. No more inflammation and joint pain. Stronger, better, able to serve and improve mental health. And I'll continue forward until I see a need to adjust. And it's true. The evidence shows that when you go from a standard American diet to something like a keto diet or even a carnivore diet, that it is going to improve your health, at least in the short term. Usually it's going to be better because you're not eating things like ice cream, right? Or excess sugar or excess refined grains. You're not eating all of the things that you were eating before. So you're restricting, feel more full. And so usually you are able to lose weight a lot easier. Honestly, it is easier to lose weight on a keto diet than it is a plant-based diet right away, at least the first couple of weeks, for sure. I'm not denying that. But here's the problem. The lack of long-term studies when it comes to following the carnivore or the keto diet is alarming. It's alarming. There's not a lot of long-term studies. We just simply don't know what could happen to you on a long-term basis. But the amount of long-term studies that we have on eating meat sparingly, on decreasing your saturated fat intake, on eating whole plant foods, it doesn't even compare. There's so much evidence that shows that you can reverse diabetes that way, that you can reverse Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, breast cancer, so many things. And so I don't want to argue against those people who are having really great results on the carnivore diet, but it's not the best long-term solution. It's not feeding your gut microbiome. It's a really great Band-Aid though. It is a really great temporary thing and that can help you. In fact, I worked with a woman who started keto, like she lost weight on keto. It's started her weight loss journey. Then she went plant-based and she felt like keto was the perfect thing to start her on the health journey because it was so extreme. And then eating plant-based felt amazing right afterwards. And so I don't want anyone's personal experience to be negated because I think you definitely can feel better. But it's a different story when you look at someone's health numbers who have eaten that way for 5, 10 years. Most people who follow that type of eating increase their cholesterol. And cholesterol matters. And you can, again, justify that away too. But cholesterol numbers do matter. And so look at the bigger picture here. Look at the most amount of research studies that we have, and it just points towards really, honestly, the word of wisdom diet. And you can say, I follow strict keto and I only eat meat and I'm in my 60s and I feel great and my blood pressure is finally stable. And it may be true. It may be true because you're not eating a lot of other crappy foods. You're eating more whole foods. And there's a lot of things that affect your health. Food is nuanced. Food is completely nuanced. And there's a lot of things that can influence your health. And I just wanted to point out that you can choose not to follow the part where it says to eat meat sparingly. That's totally fine. But justifying your way of eating by saying, actually, the comma shouldn't have been there, or actually, we need to eat meat all the time, but sparingly, or actually, this is a false tradition. All of that it's inaccurate. It's completely inaccurate, and it's not what the scriptures say. All right. I'm excited to hear your comments. So feel free to leave any comments below. For those listening on the YouTube channel, I want to hear your thoughts on all of this and anything I've left out, anything I've missed. But this is what it says. All right. I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Ali Essig. And if you need more help and support with transitioning to eating more plants so you can lose weight and improve your gut health and just reduce your risk of chronic disease, then make sure to check out my PlantWise membership. That's PlantWhys, because I like to teach the why behind eating more plants. But if all you need is just a couple more delicious recipes that feed your family and everyone loves, and not to mention super simple and easy, then make sure to check out my YouTube channel, which is also PlantWhys, PlantWhys. Hope to see you there.